Hello and welcome to RLCT 2606, Hospice, Palliative Care and Religion. I'm Professor Gillian McCann and I want to welcome you to the course. I will be going over a bit of the nuts and bolts in this section I am available for office hours Mondays and Wednesdays 12 to 1 throughout the term if you do live in the North Bay area. If not, if you want to meet with me, we can talk on the phone or through Zoom. So the development of this course came somewhat logically from the fact that Religions and Cultures has been developing courses on death, dying, and spirituality, health, healing, religion, these types of courses, and hospice and palliative care seemed the next logical step. It also emerges from the fact that I have increasingly been doing research in this area, and I do plan to share some of that with you in the course. I'm really looking forward to that. And also just because this is becoming such an important part of our culture now, and we'll be talking about that. So we'll be going largely chronologically in this course, partly just because I emerge out of the historical tradition and that works better for me, but also just because there's so much material, I feel like this is a good way to keep it a little bit contained. Now, of course, as with any topic, I won't be covering everything, but I'm trying to give you a kind of an overview. So we're going to start out with a discussion, a kind of a cultural discussion, and I'll be coming to that shortly, around what's going on in our culture currently. Are we a death-denying society, as many people have said? Is that changing? So we will be discussing that. And I'll be asking you to talk about that on the discussion board. So your participation mark will be coming from discussions on the discussion boards on Blackboard, and you'll be asked to give 5 substantive comments. You don't need to reference them, but it can't just be yes, I agree. It has to show you've reflected on the concepts or the questions being asked, or you've been responding to something that one of your peers said. Now, the discussion boards have been one of the great discoveries for me in teaching online. I don't do a huge amount of teaching online, but what I have discovered is that these discussion boards can be very effective, and sometimes people participate who wouldn't participate in person, which is something I hadn't expected. So this is a really good way for you to get a sense of other people in the course, and for me to get a sense of them. So for that first one, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about yourself, what you're studying, why you're taking the course, what you hope to get out of it, and so on. And that'll help us all to get to know each other a little bit. So we're going to start out with looking at the religious foundations of hospice and palliative care, which, just to back it up a little bit, those are 2 different things. They're related, but hospice tends to refer, or does refer, to a specific building or institution. Palliative care is more overarching. Palliative care can take place in a hospital. It can take place in a home. So I want to make sure we cover all those aspects of these related concepts. So the underlying larger philosophy and theology of hospice and palliative care emerged from the Christian tradition. Now, I am by no means saying that other religions don't have concepts of how to deal with death and dying. They all do. But the modern hospice and palliative care movement emerges specifically out of the Christian tradition, and so it's shaped in a specific way. Now, as hospice moved into places like Canada and the US, we've seen other religious traditions coming into play. So for instance, I will be looking at that. The Buddhist community has been very active in hospice as well. So I'm going to start out by looking at that early Christian community and its understanding of taking care, not just of the dying, but of the physically ill, those who are impoverished. These are all linked concepts of caritas, or selfless love and caring, and also the ideal of the Good Samaritan, that you take care of people even if they're not from the same background as you. So there's a number of these underlying concepts that I will be looking at, ideals of community, for instance, that impact into hospice and palliative care. Then we're going to be looking at what was the hospice in the medieval period, because the clear antecedents of what we're seeing in the current period is the medieval one. And so I'll be looking at a number of issues that lead to the development of those networks of hospices. The word had different meaning back then, but it was more about just pilgrims. You didn't have to be necessarily dying. It could be just often they were built for pilgrims on the way to Jerusalem, and so if somebody fell ill or they just needed a place to stay. So I will be talking about that larger concept of hospice, which is related to the words in English like hotel, hospitality, those kind of words. Then I'm going to move us into looking at the Christian nursing orders. They aren't all, a lot of them were Catholic, but some were Protestant, but the Christian nursing orders. And so far in my research, there's very little written about this, and I do not know why that is. It's been very frustrating for me, but I mean, I've met women who worked in these orders. There's the Sisters of St. Joseph in North Bay. A number of those nuns come from these kind of orders. So I will probably be dealing in this section more from just common knowledge than what's been written. And then we'll be shifting into the modern period and looking at the Victorian period attitudes to death and dying, moving us into the 20th century. Now, along with this, we need to look at what was going on with medicine, because what is most striking about the modern form of hospice and palliative care is its kind of marriage of modern medicine and religion, which, you know, most people would say that's impossible. So it did in fact happen. And so what was going on in medicine at that time, and how did it shift into the late Victorian period into the 20th century? So clearly, even just the nature of who was dying starts to change. So many of you will know that in the Victorian period, people often died young. That wouldn't have been something unusual. It's only more, I would say, kind of post-World War II, slightly before that, that we really see this assumption that everybody's going to live to be old and that you tend to die when you're old. So that had a very different impact on death and dying in the Victorian period, where it was much more common part of life. And so we will be looking at the shift that happens. And also at the larger movement of people like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote a very influential text on death and dying. So then we move to looking at the most important figure, who is Dame Cicely Saunders. And the other two, there's a kind of a triad, with Dame Cicely Saunders being the most important person, and then Florence Wald in the US and Balfour Mount in Canada. So those three were the key pioneers of the movement. And so it's an interesting way to also look at how hospice and palliative care develops differently in different settings, because obviously they have different, well, they're not completely different political systems, but they're quite different, different societies, different histories, and so on. So I'll be looking at those three in particular. And then we're going to look at how the larger movement develops, the development, and I will have a section looking at design of hospice, architecture and design of hospice, because as I said, it's very interdisciplinary, because hospice resulted in a completely different school of architecture that had to take into account the principles and ideals of hospice, including the spiritual religious aspect, which is fascinating. It's a fascinating topic. So I do want to include a section on that. We're going to be ending by looking at hospice and palliative care in Canada, which has expanded exponentially within the last 15 years or so. We'll be looking at the Compassionate Care Act that was passed in Ontario that has increasingly made hospice and palliative care part of the larger landscape of care. We've also seen the development of different religious of medical subdisciplines so for doctors and nurses in palliative care that now exist. And I'm going to be ending the course by looking at a case study of the local hospice, Nipissing Serenity Hospice, and how it exemplifies key aspects of this larger movement and how it developed and its challenges, which included and includes issues around the difference between hospice and MAID. And this has been a real real point of contention. I think it's settled down now, but when the hospice first opened, I will talk about that controversy. I was actually involved in it. And so I'm going to end by looking at the ways in which hospice and palliative care can perhaps offer us a new paradigm of care that takes into account the whole person. So my argument has been in my health, healing, and religion course that largely medicine has moved in a completely technical kind of way over the last 40 years. But hospice and palliative care has really tried to move medicine back into a discussion with the humanities, with philosophy, with theology, and so on. And also a movement towards putting the person at the center rather than the technology. So I will be talking about that. That's an ongoing question if that is possible and if that's happening. Okay, so I want to go through some of the drier material just to get this under our belts. So there will be a number of different ways, these methods of evaluation that are on the syllabus. And so the first one is going to be a reflection on, do we live in a death-denying society? Now, this one, of course, is much more based on your opinion and your experiences. So we're starting out with that kind of an assignment. You'll only need to use one outsourced source, and it can be the article that we're going to be looking at. It can be something else as well, depending on what you want to argue. But I am inviting you in this assignment to think about your own understanding of death and dying. Was it part of what your family talked about? Was it talked about in your community? Was it something that was openly acknowledged within your community? Did you go to funerals when you were a child? These kind of questions. So I'll be very interested to hear about that. The second reflection paper is 3 to 4 double-spaced pages on the topic of what is the concept of total pain as developed by Cicely Saunders. So this will have more meaning for you because I will have lectured on this topic. But part of what Cicely Saunders did was probably one of her most influential ideas has been the concept of total pain. And this is the idea that typically when people think of pain, they think just of physical pain. And when we get into discussions of death and dying, people are often, that's the first thing they go to, you know, people shouldn't be in physical pain. But what Cicely Saunders found, and she herself was a nurse and then became a doctor, was that often pain partakes of many other aspects of the personality. So when somebody's dying or ill, the pain may be physical, but it can also be emotional. It can be mental, it can be spiritual. And so she develops this idea of the many dimensions of a human being. And so when somebody's working in hospice and palliative care, they have to be aware that they're dealing with all of these aspects of the person. And so, for instance, if somebody's at end of life and they have not reconciled with somebody in their life, that may actually be the seat of their suffering. Not their pain, their physical pain may be under control, but they may be suffering for these other reasons that they're seeking to reconcile with someone in their family, for instance. That's just one example. There can be, I'll be giving different examples when we get to that section of the course. So in this reflection, you're going to be writing on that. I want to get a sense that you understand this very, very key concept that's been taken up within many of the different fields of medicine. The final essay will be 5 to 7 double-spaced typewritten pages. Based on 4 to 7 peer-reviewed sources. I will be having a discussion of what peer-reviewed sources mean. I assume you already know this. This is a second-year course, but I will be going over it. And this is a research paper. You're expected to cite sources within the paper, throughout the paper. So if you don't, I will return it and ask you to do that. The only way I know something is peer-reviewed research is if you cite those works within your paper. So of course, if you have any questions, you can contact me. So I'm asking that you use either MLA or APA. I know if people are in nursing, APA is more standard, but if you're in the humanities, MLA. But one of the two, so that it's a set way of doing your bibliography and doing citations, because otherwise it just ends up devolving into what I'm not sure if you've just made it up or it's some other system. So I would really ask you use one or the other. I already talked about participation based on the discussion boards. Plagiarism, I hope I don't have to go into too much detail about this, but obviously, if there's any indication of plagiarism, that will be checked out, and if it's found to be plagiarized in any form, AI, any of these forms, it will get an instant 0. So, I mean, I know you know this already. Okay, so I just want to quickly go through the course syllabus, and then I'll move on to opening up the discussion of this first part of the course. So, so as I said, in the first section, we're going to look at the religious roots of hospice and palliative care. And it's unfortunate, I have searched high and low, but there is no textbook for palliative care. I wish there was. I would definitely use it if there was, but there isn't. So all the material we're going to be using, I will be putting on Blackboard for you. So, so in this first part, we'll be looking at Christian concepts of health, the body, compassionate care, and community. Then we'll look at, as I said, the development of hospice in the medieval period, the role of monasteries and convents, the Crusades, and the building of public institutions such as hospitals. And so the word hospital is linked to the word for hospice. It's a similar original concept. Then we're going to move towards looking at the creation of the Catholic and Christian nursing orders, the influence of Florence Nightingale, who, as many of you will know, is extremely important in the development of ideas around nursing, the Victorian attitudes towards death and dying. Then we're going to move into looking at the founders of modern hospice and palliative care. And so we'll be spending quite a bit of time looking at the life and thought of Cicely Saunders and where she derived her ideas and what was the impetus for her moving towards creating this. And it's very interesting to look, as I said, when we look at the primary research from the archives around Cicely Saunders, that this didn't just come out of her head fully formed. It developed over time and in discussion with people. And we will be looking at the very foundational ideas coming out of Cicely Saunders came from her relationship with a specific patient that she was working with in the hospital. And so this is very important, something that I think should always be emphasized about hospice, which I think gets lost sometimes, is that it emerged out of relationship. So right from its very beginnings, Saunders was very clear that the person has to be at the center. It's not about the doctors and nurses or about the technology. That's all very important, obviously, but it has to all be centered around the person and also around their family and their community and bringing them in. So this has been something very revolutionary. Obviously, this was going on, but I think that what tended to happen in biomedicine, unfortunately, is sometimes, I think this is less so now, but the family was often seen as being obstructive, right? Now, I'm not trying to downplay the fact that I'm sure the families can be very annoying. I mean, I'm in a family, I know, but the idea that palliative care is saying, bring in the family, bring in the friends, bring in the visitors, bring in the volunteers. They can all be part of this kind of community around the person. And so this is right at the basis of palliative care from its inception. So I will be talking about that. Then, as I said, we're going to be looking at the work of Balfour Mount, who knew Cicely Saunders, went to train with her. And so what we see happening is that Cicely Saunders kind of constellates all these other people. So you could argue this was a movement waiting to happen. There were real gaps within healthcare that this moved into them. And so she very rapidly attracted a large number of people around her that then took palliative and hospice care to their various countries. And so we've seen an international palliative care movement. So I will be looking at the Canadian case. Obviously, we're in Canada. So I will look at Balfour Mount, who was a surgeon in Montreal. and he just recently wrote an autobiography, so I will be drawing on that. We're also going to look at the life and work of Florence Wald, who was a nurse, and she was actually the Dean of Nursing at Yale University when she met Cicely Saunders, and again worked very closely with her. Florence Wald is interesting. She came from a Jewish background, and she came from a very activist, civil rights kind of background, so her approach is a little bit different. So we also see the ways in which palliative care reflects very much the person who develops it, and also the society that they are in. And also the fact that Wald was a nurse, and so her insights come out also more of nursing, whereas with Mount, he's a medical doctor, so his insights are slightly different. So there's a real richness here to what each of these people brings to hospice and palliative care. Then we have study week. Then I'll be looking at the development of hospice and palliative care going forward. And so I'll be looking at palliative care framework. So very rapidly, the World Health Organization moves in and accepts palliative care as a new field within its larger framework of healthcare. And so we will be looking at that. We'll be looking at the development of the subdisciplines within medicine and nursing of palliative care. Then we'll be looking at the specific case of the Compassionate Care Act in Ontario, how that came about and what it means. And then the different forms of palliative care that have developed. So the in-home care, respite care, the ideas of family support, bereavement support, and so on. Then we're going to be looking at the architecture and design of hospice and the idea of community-based healthcare. And we'll finish off with a case study of Nipissing Serenity Hospice, which I have been involved with quite intimately, so I know it very well. I've been there many times. And so we'll be looking at how that came to be, and also how it was built, the way it's built, and also the multicultural aspect that's very important and was sort of baked into the design. So just to give you an example, Nipissing Serenity Hospice put in specific forms of ventilation that allows for smudging for traditional Indigenous ceremony and so on within the hospice. There's also, I find very interesting, because I've been to St. Christopher House in London and comparing it to Nipissing Serenity House, that Nipissing Serenity House very much leans into the fact that it's in a beautiful northern setting. It's on the fringes of a kind of conservation area. It's by a river and so on. Whereas St. Christopher House is in a busy city. It's in London. And so and not saying one's better than the other, but it's interesting to see the way the hospice sort of reflects where it's set. So I will be looking at that. And then, as I said, we're going to conclude by looking at some of the larger questions around this new paradigm of health healing and living and dying. Okay, so I'll move on now to opening out our discussion around do we live in a death-denying society? So I want to start this course with a larger kind of philosophical reflection on our society right now. And it's been said by many that we live in a death-denying society. So I want to begin by asking that question. University is all about asking questions. It's not necessarily about finding a definitive answer, but I think this is a very important question, and it's one we're really struggling with. And there's a kind of a cultural, I think, sea change happening right now. So I want you to engage with this. Is this something you have experienced? And I just wanted to say that, as I mentioned, I've taught a lot of nurses, and I had a young woman say to me, I think she's around 23 years old, that she had somebody die during one of her shifts when she was training in nursing, and she had no idea of how, she knew how to deal with this, obviously, physically and technically, but she had no idea of how to deal with this in terms of comforting the family and her own feelings about it. And this has really struck me and has actually changed the course of my research, because I found this troubling, that this obviously key part of, if you're working in healthcare, and that people that are working in healthcare are not necessarily engaging or being helped to engage with these questions. Now, death, of course, is a fundamental existential question for all human beings. And in my intro to the study of religion, I talk about the fact that it's very likely religion wouldn't even exist if human death didn't exist. And the fact that human beings, unlike animals, are able to know consciously that they're going to die. So death is fundamentally tied to religion and spirituality. There's no doubt of that. And we know that as far back as we can trace, human beings have marked death and have had rituals around it and ceremonies and so on. So how did we come to this point within our society where it's become almost a taboo? It can be a taboo topic. And I think it is important to raise the idea that the increasing secularization of society probably has something to do with this. We know that at least 25% of Canadians now have no religious, at least no formal religious belief. And so it would make sense that we would see a rising denial of death along with that. And I say that because most of the world's traditions have some explanation about what happens to us after we die, the meaning and purpose of life, the meaning and purpose of death and suffering. But if you're not given that, it becomes, I think, very difficult to engage with this existential fact of life. I think there are many different aspects of this, and of course you reflect on it in your own way, but it's also, we've been very successful. Medicine's been incredibly successful in dealing with a lot of things that used to kill us, and I will be touching on that when we look at medicine. You know, people often used to die of pneumonia and TB, and they died much younger. And so the fact that people die often, and this is a good thing, when they're elderly, I think has allowed us to some extent to kind of deny it. And I've often talked in classes about the fact we tend to want to shunt the old people into an institution. And again, that's changing too, which is very good. But up until very recently in the 20th century, we wanted to put them in an institution. We kind of don't want to engage with that because they remind us of old age and dying. And so I think these two things are linked. Our discomfort with aging and our denial of death. And so now, denial as a sort of human activity is as old as humankind. But if any of you have studied psychology, you'll know it's a very basic primitive mechanism, and it's very useful. There are certain things that the human mind and kind of emotions can't handle at a specific time, so it shuts down and it goes into denial. But anyone who studies psychology also knows this is not a long-term solution. And so death denial is a huge problem in our society. And so for me, hospice and palliative care has helped to bring this out of the shadows and bring it back into our cultural conversation. There are certainly, of course, many fears around death and dying, and I think we see this very clearly in the discussions around MAID, that people are very afraid of pain as they're dying. They're also, and for their loved ones, of course. They're also this idea of dignity at the time of death is part of the larger discussion. And I would also argue control is part of the discussion. We're very, in our society, we're all about autonomy and control. And so it's very interesting to engage with that and see how those things intersect. And certainly I will be talking about that when we look at Nipissing Hospice, the kind of the MAID approach versus the hospice palliative care approach. So I'm going to be asking you to engage with an article from The Guardian, which is a British newspaper. And I often like to start my courses with something from a newspaper. I think it sort of speaks to things that are more rooted in our own lived experience. And so the article we're going to be looking at is it's an opinion piece by Connell Hanna. So the title is "When My Dad and Brother Died, I Denied My Grief the Way We Deny the Climate Crisis, but It Didn't Go Away." So this is an interesting juxtaposition of how we deny death and we deny climate change, two things we need to grapple with directly for the good of everybody. So I really like this piece because he's very honest about his own inclinations to want to shut it out and not think about it. Obviously, it's upsetting. So he writes, ignoring a problem, however tempting, won't make it go away. It's more likely to leave an aftermath of what ifs. Okay, so he starts out by talking about how he's putting his child to bed, and his daughter says to him, "Dad, does Poppy need surgery?" So she's asking about her grandfather. So he says, "What?" My brain lurched back into the present. My father-in-law Bill had recently had surgery to remove bladder cancers. I did not want to tell my 9-year-old this, though for reasons I will explain. Certainly I didn't want to tell her right now. Okay, so he's giving the example of a child, and we know, and you probably remember this from your own childhood, children hit an age where they ask about this, like maybe a pet dies or someone in the family. And there's been a lot of controversy within society, for instance, about do you take children to a funeral? Now, people that come from religious backgrounds, that's usually not even a question. The whole family goes to a funeral, but we're seeing also with fewer and fewer traditional funerals, what do we tell children? How do we engage children with this? And I'll be very interesting to hear. I was actually shocked. I asked a group a number of years ago if they had seen a dead body, and the majority of people had, and I was shocked. I thought I was going to get 1 or 2 hands. So clearly I was off on that one. And so this is why you have to really figure out what's going on in the ground. So I will be interested to hear from all of you how your families and communities do you have open caskets? Do you have wakes? What are the rituals around it? And what was your sense of it as a child? So he goes on to talk about how his denial had, to some extent, obviously he wants to shield his child from this, right? As we tend to want to do, to shield young people from certain facts and realities until a certain point. So he's grappling with this, but the child is asked a direct question. And so he talks about the fact that within his own life, he has lost his father and his brother in rapid succession. So obviously he's dealing with a huge amount of grief in himself that he's then having to kind of work through. And so I want you to read through this piece and engage with it. I think it's very relatable and speaks to how in family systems, how do we talk about this? How do we deal with it? And then he connects it to climate change, which I think is also really important, and that, and I agree with him here, denial is not an option for issues that are this important. So I'm going to ask you to read through this article, engage with it, and you will be writing on the topic. I'm also going to include on Blackboard a link to a short documentary about a death doula. And so there's a related phenomenon that's been going on, which is, again, absolutely fascinating, of the development of people who help people through the dying process. So it's very analogous to midwifery. So that there are people that help you through birth, there are people that help you through death. And I have actually met a death doula, and so she's also a nurse. And this idea that clearly there's a need for this, and there actually are now pet chaplains that help people through the death of a pet as well. And so I think we are seeing a significant change in society. And if any of you have taken any of Dr. Shrigley's classes, I'd be very interested to have you weigh in on the discussion boards about that and what you took from that, because I know that Dr. Shrigley herself hosts death cafes and the idea of death ambassadors. And so this is something that is, as we speak, is growing as a cultural movement. So what does this say about this cultural moment, that we seem to be turning back to clearly wanting to engage with this and what it means? And I'm always amused when I've talked to people, if I talk about teaching death and dying, they're like, well, who'd want to take that? And I'm like, well, thousands and thousands of people, because anywhere these courses are offered in the university system, they're full. So clearly there's an interest in the culture in grappling with this, and often university is one of the only places that people get to do it, although I do think that's changing. So I'm going to ask you to read this article and also to watch this documentary, and then we're going to engage it and discuss it on the discussion boards.